Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to our cybersecurity series. My name is Vlad, and today we are doing a review of Netflix's latest limited series called Zero Day, whose plot essentially revolves around a major, widespread cyber attack in the United States. If you have watched the series, because it's quite short, it's 6 episodes only, or if you have heard about it, maybe you are wondering whether or not those events are credible, whether it's really within the realm of fiction. And that's what we are trying to do in this video. The distinction between credible events, credible threats, and fictional events and the liberties that were taken by the showmakers. It's featuring, of course, Robert De Niro. He will act in the TV series as a former US president, and he will be in charge of leading the investigation and leading the crisis in general in the aftermath of the cyber attack. He has a great cast aside him, and that's it. Basically, just to recap a bit on the starting point, we have a major cyber attack on the United States soil, impacting the transport infrastructures and the power grid. All of that results in a series of accidents and casualties as well, more than 3,000 casualties reported in the series. The idea is that some of the trails get derailed, some of the aircrafts are misled, there are car traffic jams and accidents as well. All of that leading to significant media pressure. Here we have some Fox News, some CNN, and in the series, they do quite well in showing you this constant, non-stop media pressure with journalists asking questions. The public also is depicted sometimes on the verge of global panic. So, in that sense, the pressure and all the crisis coordination is quite well depicted in the series. Even as a cyber professional, I quite enjoyed it, and I really recommend you to watch this limited series. It's not only about critical industrial infrastructure, so commanding the metros and the trains as we described. It's also about mobile phones from almost every citizen within the United States being hacked. And all those phones are hacked at the exact same moment, right before the infrastructures are collapsing and the cyber attack is widespread, and they all display this kind of message saying this will happen again. So that's really the starting point of the show. So phones are hacked, everybody is aware of it, and all of that happens within the same minute. Somehow, the show is limited to the United States. That's not something new when you look at the different Netflix productions or what's being produced in general in the United States or Hollywood. But that we will come back on because it's also a key notion, I think, in this series. What they do quite well is describing how time progresses slowly. This is not a TV series focusing on the first 24 hours, but instead you see the days, weeks, and months after in the aftermath. And the investigation, I felt, was kind of credible in terms of workflow, and they do not really cut corners. I mean, they don't have all the answers within just a couple of hours. But what you see here is extracts from the briefing room, which happens at day plus one. So we are already one day after the disaster, and of course, a crisis has been summoned. And around Robert De Niro, there are representatives from the NSA, the FBI, the CIA, public communications, also from the White House. So he has all those leaders around him, and he is the one expected to make some tough call and tough decisions. What they say immediately, based on the first briefing of the scenario, is that all devices, whether they were operating on Windows, Android, macOS, iOS, etc., even industrial systems that we discussed, for example, in the Stuxnet previous videos, all of those components were essentially hacked agnostically of the operating system. What they also say is that such a hack is unprecedented, first in terms of widespread and number of assets being targeted, but also the fact that they are all targeted at the same time. So here they would be correct. This has never happened before, at least not on that scale. And finally, and that's something that's heavily criticized. They play a bit here with the reality, saying that what's frightening and that's also adding pressure. At the very beginning, here we are, beginning of episode 2, they said that none of those systems showed any signs of being compromised. So if you remember, or if you have watched my previous episode on Stuxnet, we are really in this scenario where even the operators, so managing the train stations, managing the metros, all of those monitoring and control rooms, nobody saw anything. So nobody had any clue of what was really happening until the attack was detonated at the very last minute, which is again something we will come back. So, having said that, that's the beginning of the plot. I always go back to the cyber kill chain, which is something that we discussed further in detail in the episode 8. We always have, regardless of the fictional capability here, we always have the same attack path for every cyber attack ever. So it's always the 7 steps from reconnaissance. So here, from the very beginning of the show, we know that, okay, it's highly sophisticated. The hackers probably did a great job in understanding all of the intricacies of the industrial systems. And we will come back on whether or not this is credible. But then they found a super malware able to target any operating system. But then there is the question of the delivery. Of course, from the very beginning of the show, this type of sophistication really points toward foreign states, and some of them are mentioned in the TV series. I will not spoil more about it. And sometimes the reality is more complex than what's being described. Here, also, I believe that the show is making a good deal of pushing the people who watch into different directions. But what I want to stress on is the delivery. So, step 3. There can be, from the very beginning, 3 different hypotheses on how such an attack could be conducted. The first one would be that at the exact same minute, somehow the hackers find a way to push the malware to all of the devices. So we are talking about 300 million mobile phones plus the industrial systems that were targeted. But doing that, and that would be like the first hypothesis, doing that requires probably to have compromised the entire telecommunication industry, because you need to deliver a malware which is sometimes a few megabytes in size, but you have to do it 300 million times across the entire country. Um, and we know that even if somehow you manage to do it, there will be bottleneck issues. There will be devices that will not respond. So reaching such a size, that's already quite problematic. Rather than doing that on the very first minute, like really when you push the red button saying, okay, now we will launch our attack, you could think that maybe the malware was introduced before on the mobile phones, on the assets that were impacted. And there could be, again, 2 different hypotheses there. Either you say, well, the malware was introduced on a hardware level, meaning that directly on the chipsets, something was infected and there was a malware in it. So here, that would directly point at the chipsets manufacturers, mostly in Korea or Philippines today, also in Taiwan. Um, or you say that this could be a software vulnerability that are being exploited. Maybe there is a software component, like, for example, a mobile app that has been installed by all of the citizens in the United States, or something that is embedded by default in, for example, Apple. And here, of course, you could reach such a widespread attack. Just to comment on those 3 hypotheses, so just the fact that you could directly attack millions of devices, that's quite unrealistic, because not all of them are connected to the internet, not all of them are reachable, and it's not only about finding those assets, it's about pushing the malware to them, and that would never have the kind of effect that is depicted in the series. So this scenario, they are not even looking at it in the TV shows, they are directly focusing on the others. So thinking that a malware has somehow been embedded. Speaking of the hardware, that would be quite complex because those components are heavily audited. There are many different manufacturers, so you would have to compromise many of the production chains, which is of course unrealistic. And those type of attacks are extremely rare. What we have seen, for example, in Israel, the Mossad was able to introduce some explosives within the Hamas pagers, but doing so really requires uh, well, insights on the manufacturing production chains, planting bugs or planting explosives, and making sure that you do it on a so limited uh, bunch of tools or bunch of phones that in the end it's not discovered. Because the problem with introducing your malware right from the beginning is that, of course, there are a lot of researchers around the world. They are going to dissect your different components, and you want your components to be shipped all across the United States before launching your attack. And that, in terms of logistics and workflow, that would, of course, be unrealistic. Then we have the path of the middle, doing the same thing but on a software level. And here, it's also something that is quite credible this time, because we have had in the past many examples of software updates being the source of a major compromise. There was a hack of SolarWinds. There were different hacks more recently also of security components. So pushing a compromised update or embedding a malware in an application, that's really feasible, and that's one of the leads that is being pursued here in the TV series. If we go a bit more in the detail on what is credible or what is possible versus what is completely fiction, this is what I would like to propose. So here we are going to order and rank from the possible segment to the fiction some of the items that I've picked up in the first two episodes of the TV series. I won't spoil much of the investigation and what happens afterwards, but just based on those very introduction moments that I described. So first of all, thinking that all sectors could be attacked at once, that's completely fiction, simply because even if they are, and that's true, there are hundreds or if not thousands of vulnerabilities available. And if you look at, for example, the Windows security bulletins that come every Tuesday, they are patching every Tuesday tens or sometimes hundreds of vulnerabilities. Um, and among those vulnerabilities, there can be some of them are quite critical and could allow a malicious person to completely take over your infrastructure. But you would have to do that on all of the operating systems. So we are talking about hundreds of versions, some of which would be patched, some of them would not. So even if there are different versions of operating systems, there are also different levels of patching. And so your exploit would have to work across all of that, across Windows, across Linux, across CentOS. That's completely unrealistic. And what's even more unrealistic would be targeting those industrial systems independently. So what we have seen in the Stuxnet example is that the malware remains hidden really well, but is really focusing on the nuclear installations and is specifically looking for Siemens components, specifically looking for certain rotation speeds in order to be sure that they are targeting centrifuges. So there is a very high level of preparation and sophistication to make sure that the orders that are being interpreted and received, or when the virus acts as a man in the middle to be sure that it's sending direct orders to the PLCs, but nothing is being witnessed from the control room. That's something that you can do maybe on a few industrial systems, but definitely not on all of the possibilities. Targeting aircrafts is really different from targeting metro systems or train systems. Those have nothing to do with each other. And even within one sector in particular, for example, nuclear facilities, here, Stuxnet, it took them years to target specifically the centrifuges. They did not target all of the industrial components, only the centrifuges. So that's definitely fiction. But what could be credible would be first identifying within a sector a single point of failure or a few single points of failure. I gave you the example in a previous video of United Health Group. If you somehow manage to compromise a key player in an industry, blocking all of the invoices, blocking all of the medical invoicing systems, that could affect an entire sector, in this case, the healthcare industry. That's something we talked about in a previous episode. If you manage to block, for example, a pipeline, that's something we talked about in episode 15, the colonial pipeline hack, you could have an impact on the entire fuel and oil deliveries across the United States. So again, if you really focus on single point of failures, yes, you could have a devastating impact, but only on a specific sector and sometimes in a specific region of the United States. And what's more likely would be that the attack would be spread over days or weeks, because attacking all of the sectors or all of the industry in a single minute, that's extremely unlikely. As I said, not all of the devices are exposed on internet, thankfully. They are not always available, and you would have to find also vulnerabilities, not only for the systems themselves, but you need to understand that the servers and the control rooms, they are hidden behind several layers of protections, several layers of firewall or different security components. And the idea is that not only do you need a vulnerability for those systems, but you also need to breach step by step all of those infrastructures. And doing so multiplies completely the scale of your attack. In Stuxnet, as I described in the previous episodes of the podcast, they used six top vulnerabilities. Four of them were completely unheard of, but those vulnerabilities were specific to a single component, to a single operating system, and they were doing a specific action. And that was already believed to be an extensive, overwhelming show of force, because if you are using so many vulnerabilities in a row, you are kind of showing your hand, because then researchers will understand where did you go through, what are the mechanisms that you have circumvented, or what are the flows that you have exploited, and they can immediately maybe patch one of them, and then your entire attack sequence goes off the window and it's no longer applicable. So here, for something like this to happen in the TV series, you would have to somehow find hundreds of critical vulnerabilities, find a credible scenario going from one to the other, and bypass so many security components that it's completely fiction. And also, it's also likely that your attack would be stopped between or within hours or days. There were some examples quite recently where hackers somehow managed to deploy a super malware on the healthcare industry. Many hospitals were targeted. It was a ransomware in this case. Uh, but the idea is that even if you manage to deploy your ransomware, at some point it needs to receive or send orders to your command center. And what could also happen is that the hackers somehow manage to infect many devices, but at the moment where they try to send new orders or to execute certain queries, the command center is no longer available. And that can be done by the authorities. They can maybe shut down the server, maybe they can buy the domain, maybe they can do different actions. And one of these widespread hack was prevented a few years ago because one of the researchers identified that the malware was doing a specific query. The malware was checking whether or not a certain website was available, and the researcher decided to buy that website. By doing so, the malware completely went idle and was waiting for additional instructions. What I'm trying to say is that even if you launch such a widespread attack, there are researchers all around the world, security professionals, who would analyze the different flows and would find quite quickly one patch or one adaptation or making sure that this attack is no longer working. Something that's also fiction is that when they say that the malware left no evidence or traces, that's completely unrealistic. A malware leaves tons of forensic evidence. Every time that a new process is created, that there is evidence on the system. Every time that malware is using memory or is using or accesses certain elements on the disks, that's also recorded on the systems. New accounts, logins, logout, all of that is logged on the different systems. The data flows are also logged by other security components. So there are plenty of evidence to be analyzed. So saying that a malware somehow goes dormant and nobody knows whether or not the systems are affected, that's completely fiction. What is true is that it takes extremely, sometimes a long time to analyze all of that and to sort which of these indicators are pertaining to the malware versus the natural life cycle of the components. But that's the job of the forensic investigators. Also, something that I would like to come back on is that here in the TV series, the impact is completely limited to the United States of America. But then you could wonder, how is it possible that a group of hackers somehow segments exactly which devices are attacked versus the others? If they do a bunch of attacks on all the mobile phones, I could assume that there would be some diplomats or some embassies that would be also targeted within the United States. So the incident would immediately go global. They also mentioned that there are 3,400 casualties. Statistically speaking, there has to be foreign nationals in there. So I'm a bit disappointed in the sense that the show really focuses on the US and does not show other diplomatic intricacies that could happen. But also from an asset perspective, if we consider that some of those infrastructures are also running in the cloud, for example, on Amazon AWS or on Google Cloud or Microsoft Azure, those cloud service providers are hosting much more than US data or US applications. They are also being used all around the world. And so targeting those systems also, it would have had consequences on other countries or other services. So just from a scenario construction perspective, focusing on the US, I mean, great, that's the showrunner decision, but showing that the impact is somehow limited to the US, quite a stretch. Something that also I found interesting is that at the very beginning of the investigation, so we are at the, I think, beginning of episode 2, they managed to identify some of the suspects, at least initial suspects, because the investigation goes on and on. And having pinpointed one of them, they say, okay, we are going to analyze all the SMS, all the text messages that were sent in a certain area. So that's completely feasible because the text messages by default, they are using SS7 protocols, which are not encrypted. So you could theoretically analyze all of the text messages sent in a certain area, depending on the cell towers that were involved in the transmission. But then they also say, well, we have the NSA, we have the CIA around the table. We are also going to analyze all of the um, private apps messaging, everything that occurred in this area. And that's completely also, I think, fictional because it would require extensive, in-depth cooperation with those applications. For example, Messenger, WhatsApp, Signal, all of the Telegram, all of them would have to somehow work with the authorities on a quite, I mean, almost immediately, and they would have to provide the logs from those connections. But when you are using Signal on your mobile phone, you are not directly using the cell towers. If you are connected via Wi-Fi or if you are using a VPN, then it's absolutely not feasible to identify exactly who was within a certain area and geolocate every possible suspect using WhatsApp or having sent WhatsApp messages in a certain area. And even if that would happen, even if somehow they have the cooperation from WhatsApp or from Signal, they have the logs and they can say, well, this messages was sent on a Wi-Fi connection and this Wi-Fi router is based in a certain area. You need to understand that the hackers today, they are not even using those applications. They rather go for forums or in-app messages. So they would download, for example, a dump game on the App Store, and within this game, they would send each other messages. So they are not necessarily using the traditional messaging tools or messaging platforms that you and I use on a daily basis. They would rather focus on obscure, low-key applications in order to exchange messages with each other. What's also slightly, I think, exaggerated in the TV series is that, as we have seen, there is this message that is being displayed on the mobile phones saying, well, this will happen again. So it's really a threatening message. However, you need to understand that from a cybersecurity perspective, it's much easier to shut down a certain device or at least break something than taking it completely over. You can flood a system with messages or with data flows. You can flood something by overusing the memory. So you can shut down systems quite easily or disrupt systems. But in order to, without leaving a trace, take over a smartphone, change completely the layout, and print a certain message, also doing it at such a scale, that's slightly exaggerated because it really requires administrative privileges on each of the devices. And as we said, that would require an exploit working on so many different operating systems, so many different versions, so many different configurations. That's, well, it's a bit exaggerated. Not, it's feasible to a certain extent, and you could do it on a smaller perimeter, but doing that at scale at the exact same minute, slightly overreaching. And two other things that I found also quite exaggerated is that all of the physical controls and all the operators, nobody saw anything, and all those physical controls somehow either failed or were deactivated by the hackers. You need to understand that in the context, for example, of Stuxnet, it took years of preparation to be sure that all of the actions and the variations in the speeding speeds of the centrifuge were not directly reported to the operators. So being somehow in this man in the middle configuration takes a lot of preparation. So doing that on such a scale, not credible. I will give you one example. In 2021, there was this water treatment facilities in Florida that was successfully hacked, but the operators, they immediately identified that something was going wrong when they saw that the levels of ammoniac were reaching and going beyond a certain threshold. So the ammoniac is just a chemical that is used within the water to make sure that it's proper for consumption because it removes all of the bacteria. However, if you go beyond a certain threshold, then the water is no longer safe for consumption. And the operator basically said that, well, he started seeing the mouse moving on its own and certain parameters were evolving, so they were able to manually revert the changes from the hackers. And that's exactly what I would like to point out today. Even if the power grid goes out, even if your IT systems go out, at some point you have the human judgment that can revert certain changes or take some decisions. Think of it as when you are driving your own car, even if the signals, even if everything goes out, um, you can still drive your car and you can still take a decision whether or not you should go through a crossroad, for example. And that's the same thing with trains, the same thing with metro. Even if somehow they are left in the dark, they can still decide to slow down or at least shut down certain systems or shut down their engine until further notice. So having so many casualties from the confusion and the entire mess, not complete. I mean, it's exaggerated. Again, could be feasible on a significant, or sorry, on a significant and single systems or a single company, but not at the scale that is being depicted in the TV series. What I did like, though, and I mentioned it a bit earlier, is that as we have seen, identifying the culprits in the TV shows, it could take weeks, it could take even months. Sometimes it's not even feasible at all. But what I did like really about this TV series is that they are following the money, they are following the individuals themselves, and it's really there to show you that those cyber attacks, they are not committed by machines or just servers in general. In the end, it's all about people giving instructions, and you need to work the man. There has to be some interviews. There are suspects. There are arrests, and I did like this part of the show showing that all. I mean, retracing the steps, retracing the money, retracing the different techniques and tactics implemented by the hackers. It's not straightforward. You can make mistakes as well, and it takes significant time. So that's would be a bit my conclusion and my take on this TV show. I do encourage you to have a look at it. But then, yes, some of the events are fictional. They show you that also some decisions are the wrong ones. They take some turns, so that's also quite quite convincing in the sense that the hero doesn't always have the silver bullets and the right answer from the beginning. So all those aspects about the series I enjoyed. But yeah, you need to understand that the scale that is depicted, that's fictional. even though some of the attacks could work on identified specific companies or specific systems. Let me know if you enjoyed the series. Let me know if you watch it, and I will see you soon in another video. Goodbye.